Hello and welcome to the Drexel Interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohn, and today our guest is composer Jennifer Higdon. Jennifer Higdon is a major figure in contemporary American classical music. She is the recipient of 4 Grammy Award nominations for her CD Cityscapes, and her orchestral work, Blue Cathedral, is one of the most performed works in America today. She lives in Philadelphia and she teaches at the Curtis Institute, and we feel very lucky to have her here because she's much sought after lately by the media. Jennifer Higdon, welcome to the Drexel Interview.
Thank you very much.
For our audience, I want to say that at the beginning of this program we usually have a little snippet of Handel, but we played a little bit of Higden today.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
We played a little of your dash for clarinet, violin, and piano, and we'll play a little bit at the end, too, and I want to thank you and Curtis for allowing us to use that.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It really is.
And I wonder if you talk a little bit about that piece as to start us off and tell us about what inspired it and what you intended to relay when you wrote it.
Well, I wrote it for this group called the Verdere Trio. It's made up of clarinet, violin, and piano, and they've been very active in commissioning works. They've commissioned probably almost 100 different works from various composers around the world, and I had judged a competition where they had submitted a bunch of works for grants. I noticed all of the works they had on their grant application were 15 to 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking this group really needs something that moves along quickly, but also that is short, something that's very succinct that gives a picture of them. So I decided to write a work that would move at a fast pace. That's where I got the title, that's the dash. And then it would show off really their virtuosic capabilities, because it's not an easy work. There are a lot of notes crammed in a very short amount of time. So that was the idea behind the piece.
Well, that's a good commentary. We'll keep it in mind when we hear it at the end. Many people are daunted by classical music, and they're especially daunted by contemporary classical music, which actually sounds odd, doesn't it? Contemporary classical.
It doesn't quite go together.
Yeah, but we know what we mean. And you have been singled out as being particularly accessible. I mean, I'll quote here Daniel Patrick Stearns, who writes for the Philadelphia Inquirer, who says that a Higden piece leaves you not knowing what has swept over you, but in a non-confrontational way. The experience is more like entering a parallel universe that feels familiar but is not. Interesting contrast there. Do you think about accessibility when you write your music and trying to open classical music to a larger audience?
Yeah, you know, what I think about is communicating. I figure as a composer that's probably the biggest job that I'm supposed to accomplish. And I think some of this may have grown out of the fact that in my childhood I didn't listen to classical music. I didn't grow up around classical music. In fact, when I entered college to study music, I didn't even know the Beethoven symphonies. So I've got a very awkward background, but my background actually matches what the majority of people in the United States have. So I grew up around a lot of rock and roll, also bluegrass, because I lived in East Tennessee. Yeah, that's right. That's where it comes from. But I think because I grew up around a lot of other music that wasn't classical, when I came to classical, I found it fascinating. First of all, I thought the depth of classical was really intense, and I was very impressed, and it was intriguing enough that I'd want to spend my life embracing it. But I also came at it from an angle of, well, I want to make sure this is interesting for the people like me who didn't have classical in their background. So when I'm writing a piece of music, I think about the fact that the piece has to communicate. For me, that's the most important thing. Doesn't mean I have to compromise the quality, which is something a lot of people wonder about. I believe wholeheartedly in melody. I believe in clear rhythm. I love to be able to hear the harmonic movement, which is not something we've had in a lot of contemporary classical. But for me, to be engaged in a piece, there are certain things that I need in the piece when I'm listening, and I'm sure that comes from my background, what I grew up around.
That's interesting. I mean, you say you believe in melody?
Yes.
Are you looked upon askance? Are there people that, I mean, how is that looked upon within the more contemporary, cutting-edge classical scene?
That's a good question. It used to be that everyone looked at me with one eyebrow raised and they thought I was a little crazy, but they're not. I get enough performances now, they're not thinking that anymore.
You'll bring back melody. That's interesting. So you feel it's this combination of your kind of non-classical background with your
Right.
discovering it late. What was the defining moment of your discovering that you loved the classical tradition, that you wanted to work within that tradition?
That's a really good question. I'm not really sure because my beginning was very unusual. Usually students go in and they take lessons when they're very young. I picked up a flute at the age of 15 and taught myself to play. So I went through band method books, which had very simple melodies, told you how to read music, how to finger things on the flute, explain dynamics. But for me, I think probably I started exploring records at that time. I started listening to classical music just that I randomly picked up in the library, and I thought, wow, this is something I'm not familiar with. And I think the fact that I wasn't familiar with it made it intriguing for me. Fortunately for me, I didn't realize that for going into music, I probably should have more of a background in classical. It never occurred to me that I couldn't do it, but it just meant there was a lot of work. I forged ahead, and I just didn't even think anything about it. So, but I've thought about this a lot because people frequently ask me, they want to know what it is about my music that's different, and I don't know that there are things that I can point to that are that different, but I can tell you that I have a tendency to make musical events in my music happen faster, turn over faster. I always like a clear pulse and a clear rhythm, and I think those things come from listening to so much Beatles. Actually, I think it was Simon and Garfunkel growing up. I think it was the bluegrass that I heard up in the mountains in East Tennessee. The rate that the music changes in that music is actually faster than it is in classical. So I think my system may have been attuned to a faster change in the music. And so I brought that to my classical. Now, I didn't realize I was doing this because I was writing instinctively in the classical, but after a lot of people
started
looking at it.
You were writing instinctively in that form?
Yeah.
And you were sort of drawn to it
It happened without me having a conscious thought to do it, but after I went back and looked at some pieces, when people started asking me about it, I realized, oh, they're right. The music actually does change textures fairly frequently, and I'm very careful that I don't stay on an idea too long. And rhythm plays a big part in my music, too.
Yeah, I wonder, I mean, maybe this is a very naive question, but how do you define classical? You know, when you say that people listened to your music and they said it was this, as opposed to, I don't know what you thought it was.
Right.
How do you define this, whatever it is that you're writing within?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure exactly how to describe classical when I think about it, because when you study music, you learn that it's a certain time period within music that fits within the Renaissance, Baroque, classical, Romantic era. And then I live in the 20th and 21st century portion of that, but we also group all of that together. Normally the pieces I find tend to have a very profound sort of sound and usually use a lot more instruments than you might find in, say, a rock band. But having said that, I've also heard pop pieces that I thought were actually pretty profound, and I know that there's a lot of music out there that moves people, and that's the most important thing. Okay. I think I take an emotional message from the stuff I listened to as a child and try to apply it in the music that I write.
You said that you played the flute, and
right.
I assume you still do.
Yep.
Do you find yourself gravitating toward that instrument when you write, or any particular instruments that you have more of an affinity for, or does it work that way?
Yeah, you know, when I first started out writing, I wrote a lot of flute music because I could play the works. So people would ask me to play. That's usually what composers do. It's like Chopin writing piano music. But I find now that I avoid writing for flute. If I'm writing an orchestral work, I sometimes put a flute solo in, but I always make it really short because everyone has that expectation.
Oh.
So I tend to gravitate more towards strings. Now, I don't know if that's because I've played so much flute that the sound doesn't find a resonating place in me in the same way that string instruments do. But I have 6 string quartets, a piano quintet, and a piano trio. So I've written a lot of string music. I just find the colors fascinating, but I try to be very careful not to overdo it on the flute.
Okay. Your composition process, I wonder if you talk a little bit about that. I mean, as a writer, I certainly go through different stages. I'm inspired by certain things. I go through a revisionary process that's quite complicated and grueling and stressful.
There's a lot to it, isn't there?
And I get stalled and blocked and all of that. Does the same sort of thing happen for you?
It does, actually. You know, I find it fascinating to read books on writing words for this very reason, because it's the same process. We have those things we stumble upon. We have certain themes we try to develop. Usually I look at the group I'm writing for. I look at the instrumentation. They almost always tell me how long a piece they want. Then I look at what kind of music they like to play, because that varies from group to group. And then I try to shape a piece. I daydream a lot, actually. I try to shape a piece out of daydreaming based on what information they've given me.
But that's interesting. As you're talking about commissioned music. And so that implies that most of what you write...
Everything I write is commissioned.
Is that unusual? I mean, obviously it didn't start out that way.
Right. I've been actually writing completely on commission since 1992.
Really?
Which is a long time. And you're right, it is a little unusual. I'm very fortunate in that respect that I'm able to write. I have enough commissions. I write between 6 and 12 pieces a year. It's actually gotten to the point where I'm turning commissions down because I have my schedule filled up to 2011, and I don't know what I'm going to feel like writing in the years after that, so I've kind of put a halt to it. But it's a wonderful thing.
And you don't feel constrained by it?
Not at all. I know a lot of people ask me that. They're like, but they're telling you what they want. But they're only telling me a little bit of information. I still have 999,000 decisions that I have to make in the process.
What do they tell you? What are usually
They usually tell me something about if there's an event or an occasion. I once wrote a piece recently for a junior high band in the suburbs here in Philadelphia, and I had to talk to the teacher a lot about what are the restrictions for junior high band, because they have very serious limitations. And you want to respect that because you want the kids to be challenged but not discouraged. But that's very different than the piece I wrote after that was for the Chicago Symphony, so I could kind of let my imagination run wild. Although the Chicago Symphony piece actually was one of their train commissions for the Ravinia Festival, which has a train that runs through the backyard, often goes blowing through in the middle of concerts. So they decided to commission a bunch of works that would incorporate the train sound. So I knew I needed to incorporate sounds that sounded like a train in that piece, and they wanted it to be a concert opener, so it was 10 or 12 minutes. So I got a little bit of information. It was just enough to let my imagination run wild.
I guess there must be something to be said for having these constraints, because it's helpful in a way.
It's very helpful, actually. Yeah, you would think that it would be constricting in some way, but I have so many decisions I have to make anyway that it's nice that someone makes 2 or 3 of the decisions for me. And I find that actually kind of inspires me to kind of work around whatever it is that the organization, the commissioner, might need.
Okay. Your piece, the Cityscapes piece, was written for the Atlanta Symphony
Yes,
Orchestra.
right.
And was it meant to evoke Atlanta? I mean, is there a sense in which the city is inspiring?
Well, I was thinking about Atlanta because I lived there for a little while when I was very young, and but I was thinking about cityscapes in general. There's a perfect example. They told me they wanted a 3-movement work. And so they were very specific. The first movement needed to be a concert opener. It needed to be around 7 minutes. They had a certain orchestration, a certain size orchestra, because they were going to take that particular movement out on tour. They weren't going to take the entire orchestra with them. They knew that the last movement needed to be about an educational theme that they were about to explore with the kids in Atlanta the following year, form and music. So they were working on rondo form. So I knew that I had to write something where we'd have musical material that would be returning occasionally. The A, because rondo is A, B, A, C, A, D, the A comes back. So I knew I needed to write something where I had a certain chunk of music that would be returning. So, and they also only use half the orchestra for their education program, so the orchestra was even smaller, and I knew that movement needed to be between 6 and 8 minutes, because that's about the right amount of time to hold all these kids, their attention. And then they wanted me to use the entire orchestra in the middle movement, and they wanted a tone poem, something very slow and lyrical. So they actually set the parameters. They said maximum 35 minutes for the entire thing, and they gave me the instrumentation, a different instrumentation for each movement, and they told me just how long it needed to be.
That's very specific. Is
It's
that
extremely.
unusual? And you sound so game, you know, so willing. I'm wondering, number one, if most of these cases are so specific, and also if most composers are so easy about it.
Some composers don't like it at all. Sometimes I've seen composers where they will be told to write a 20-minute piece and they'll come back with a 45-minute piece. But it's actually, that's a problem for an orchestra. If they're rehearsing, they have a certain amount of time slotted, and they can't really go over the amount of time that's slotted. It causes problems. So I find it just intriguing to be given these parameters and then try to match up. And I've had good luck with it. Knock on wood, basically, because it's actually worked out. It has not been any kind of restriction. But they're not all like that. You're right. I mean, there are instances. I'm writing a piano concerto for Long Long in the National Symphony, and they said, well, how long a piece do you want to write? So I asked the pianist, Long Long, I said, what do you want? He says, well, I'd like a 25 to 30-minute work. So I said, okay, whatever. But
so you're very sort of, out or directed.
It's part of it is it's controlling your art, but also allowing the